It was a freezing cold and rainy morning on the 25th of November 2022 when police were alerted to the discovery of a body covered in a mysterious white powder. Immediately, this case appeared to be different to any previous investigations that had landed on their desks before. The area was not known to be associated with crime. Around 90% of its residents were over 60 years old. There were no witnesses, no suspects, no evidence, and no motive. And, to add to the confusion, very little was known about the victim. A passerby had spotted the body, which was later identified as 38-year-old Liam Smith, on the pavement while driving down Kilburn Drive, a quiet residential street in the village of Shevington in Wigan, shortly before 7 p.m. GMT on the 24th of November. The discovery was as alarming as it was challenging. It appeared the body had been disfigured with an unknown substance to conceal any clues. At first, officers weren't even sure if it was the body of a man or a woman. As the rain poured down, forensic officers worked to preserve the crime scene, which was being treated as a chemical, biological, radioactive, nuclear incident, bringing an extra layer of complication to the investigation. This also meant both detectives were unable to see the body for the first 24 hours after the discovery. Several theories had already been bandied around during this time. One was that the body had fallen from an aeroplane. Another was that the killing had happened at a different location and the body had then been dumped. It was only after listening to a recording from a nearby house, which captured a loud bang about 15 minutes before the body was discovered, that gave police the golden clue about what had happened. The loud noise had come from a firearm shot in close proximity to where the body was found. It later transpired the body was of a man named Liam Smith, a father of two who worked as an electrician, who had been lured from his home and shot in the face before acid was then thrown over his face and body as he lay dying. What followed was one of the most complex investigations that Greater Manchester Police had ever undergone, as they tried to find the person or people responsible. You are watching OCG TV. It was 6 weeks before the missing pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. There had been 3 main lines of investigation: the victim's background, a Shogun vehicle spotted in the area at the time of the killing, and the murder weapon. The vehicle was of particular interest to investigators. Initial CCTV had shown someone in the Shogun loitering in the area suspiciously on the day of and day before the murder. But new dashcam footage of the Shogun vehicle using a different registration plate had now come to light. It was the breakthrough detectives had been waiting for. It showed a man doing hostile reconnaissance 3 weeks before Liam's murder. Police were then able to run a search on that registration plate, which took them to the nearby city of Sheffield. On November 5th, 3 weeks before Liam's death, a man was stopped by local police. In the car were the registration plates it would later transpire were used on Hillier's Mitsubishi Shogun. This led to a second man, who admitted that he had been asked by Hillier to organise the purchase. Both men were arrested, but they were quickly ruled out as being involved in the murder. More extensive CCTV inquiries followed, focusing on the commercial premises owned by the second man. They were in luck. The Shogun vehicle was seen pulling up at the premises with the same registration plate used in the reconnaissance trip to Shevington. They had their suspect. Now, they just needed to identify him. He was identified as Michael Hillier, aged 39, a hulking figure who didn't seem to have a full-time job, but seemingly had all the trappings of wealth. Hillier was tracked down to his home and he was taken into custody. He gave no-comment responses during his interview and forced detectives to dig further into his personal life. His car insurance details identified another person who was registered to the vehicle, a Miss Fulstow. Officers first interviewed Fulstow as a witness after she was found in Hillier's phone. Detectives were aware they were a couple, but suspiciously, Hillier had failed to mention her existence. An intelligence officer found Fulstow was listed as a named driver on his car insurance. Coupled with her inconsistent answers as to what they found on her phone, she became a suspect. Rachel Fulstow was not your typical suspect in a murder case. Born in Goole, Yorkshire, she took an interest in the hospitality industry at school and studied travel and tourism at college. She graduated from Leeds Metropolitan University in 2008 with a 2:1 in international tourism management before finding a job as a wedding coordinator at a hotel. For the next decade, she worked for the huge hotel chains Radisson and Hilton before deciding to change careers after COVID hit in 2020. She enjoyed a successful professional life, earning a comfortable £45,000 a year, but there was a gap. She doted on her nieces and longed to have children of her own. Fulstow had turned to dating apps after being unlucky in love. This is where she matched Liam Smith. A decision to swipe right would set off a chain of events that would end in one of them dead. Smith and Fulstow seemed to hit it off. After 2 or 3 weeks of messaging, the pair decided to meet up for a first date. Mr. Smith travelled to York in September 2019, and the pair enjoyed drinks and food together. Fulstow had arranged a hotel for Smith to spend the night at, given the distance from his home. After their night out, she had planned to take a taxi the short distance home, but after being told there was an hour's wait for a cab, she and Mr. Smith headed to the hotel bar. When they were told the bar was shutting down for the night, the pair headed back to his room. Exactly what happened in that hotel room is unclear. Fulstow has since claimed Mr. Smith made non-consensual sexual advances and that he immediately apologised. She said she spent the rest of the night with him and then had lunch together the following day. The pair then went their separate ways, but save for a few practical messages, the relationship didn't go anywhere. Fulstow didn't go to the police about what may or may not have happened in the hotel room. She didn't tell another soul, but when she did tell someone, Mr. Smith's fate was sealed. Michael Hillier had led a very different life to Rachel Fulstow. Unlike her, he had a chaotic upbringing. Raised in Aylesbury in the southeast of England, his parents were allegedly violent drug addicts. He worked as a plasterer and moved around the country, living in Swindon and Oxford before settling in Sheffield. For more than 2 decades prior to killing Mr. Smith, Hillier had been involved in the underground world of drugs. He earned 95% of his money, which he estimated at being a 6-figure salary over a year, through large-scale involvement in the cannabis trade, using burner phones, pay-as-you-go SIM cards and cash transactions to stay under the radar. Hillier had become a professional criminal. He had transformed his 3-bedroom terraced property into a cannabis factory using specialized equipment. Like Fulstow, Hillier had previous relationships, but ultimately had designs on starting a family. He kept a draft, unsent email within which he detailed his sexual conquests, adding details unique to each lover. Fulstow became number 80 on the list. After a few dates, Hillier admitted to a friend that he was head over heels in love and felt he was punching above his weight. As they got to know each other better, the pair began to delve into each other's history. Fulstow recounted what she claimed to have happened in that hotel room in York with Mr. Smith back in 2019. She recalled describing a non-consensual incident, but didn't regard it as rape. Hillier claimed she told him that she feared she'd die during the alleged incident. The graphic detail sent him into a rage, and the seed of revenge was sown. In those preceding months, Hillier claimed various plans were bandied around, some more extreme than others. According to him, in one version, Mr. Smith's penis would be severed so he could never rape anybody again. In another scenario, he would be lured on the pretense of a job before being ambushed in a remote location. But it was decided that Hillier, who had an interest in firearms and possessed an illegally held sawn-off shotgun, would acquire a gun. Over several weeks and months of experiments, he converted a blank firing pistol, bought legally from a shop in Nottingham. Filling the barrel with pellets and a ball bearing, Hillier claimed the gun was designed to stun and disable Mr. Smith so he could then throw acid over him without having to touch him and potentially transfer incriminating DNA evidence. Finally satisfied with his homemade gun, Hillier made further preparations. He bought a Mitsubishi Shogun, which he'd used to travel to Wigan, and acquired false number plates to keep him under the radar. Hillier drove to Wigan on November 2nd, 3 weeks before the killing, to scope out Mr. Smith's house. He was ready to strike that night if the opportunity arose. All the while, Mr. Smith was completely unaware that he was being targeted in such a cold and calculated way, with the help of a woman he'd last seen more than 3 years ago. Hillier arrived at about 7:30 a.m. and only returned at about 9 p.m. That day, full stow, a decision which would come back to haunt her. She texted Hillier at about 10:30 a.m. saying, "Morning, hope you slept okay. You were probably still sleeping, as I assume you're feeling pretty rough still. Remember, this struggle right now with our diazepam is temporary, and I have absolute faith you can taper off and be in a much better place over the next few months. It's not easy, but it will be worth it. I love you very much. I will try calling again later to see how you are, but understand if you don't feel up to talking." It was an attempt to give Hillier a false alibi. Like his previous visit, he spent hours around Kilburn Drive, casing out the area. Eventually, at about 6:40 p.m, Hillier made his move. He walked down Mr. Smith's drive, looking for a sign of movement. As he saw him inside through the window, he hesitated and moved back to the Shogun. Understandably, with a stranger lurking outside his home, Mr. Smith went to investigate. He moved towards Hillier, who by now was back in the driver's seat of the car. Little did Mr. Smith know that he was unwittingly walking to his death. Hillier grabbed the gun, pointing it at Mr. Smith, taking him completely by surprise. Now was the moment Hillier had been waiting for. Mr. Smith immediately collapsed before Hillier doused him in acid. He then administered an alkaline solution in an apparent bid to neutralize the acid so any first responders would not be hurt. It appeared in his mind he had justified his actions. He had declared Mr. Smith guilty without any sense of due process or fairness, so he must pay. Hillier would later claim he was blinded by love and his decision-making blurred by an addiction to prescription drugs. Then, the elaborate bid to escape justice began in earnest. It almost worked. As Mr. Smith lay dead, the acid still reacting to his body, Hillier drove north in the Mitsubishi. He eventually arrived at Stang Forest near Barnard Castle in County Durham. The Shogun was later discovered burnt out there by dog walkers. Hillier then rode a bike which he'd brought with him, cycling about 20 miles to Darlington train station, where he boarded a service to York. He took a taxi back to Fulstow's home. It was the next morning when Hillier arrived at her door. Fulstow would later maintain this was the first she'd heard of Mr. Smith's death. While Hillier would later describe how she was hugging and kissing him on his arrival, thanking him for what he'd done. On either version, Fulstow carried on her day as normal. She even attended a work Christmas party later that day. Fulstow spent the weekend with Hillier. They disposed of evidence in a fire, burning the gun and clothes he wore at the time of the killing. She then dropped him off back home in Sheffield. Days later, the couple boarded a flight to Jamaica, but even as the pair holidayed together, the net was closing in. Police had launched a manhunt and had scoured the area around Mr. Smith's home for CCTV footage. When they returned to British soil, Hillier learned of the first dominoes to fall. The connection between him and the fake number plates had been made. And through Hillier, the police came to Fulstow. At first, she was treated as a witness. She volunteered the fact that she'd been in a relationship with Mr. Smith previously, a line of inquiry which the police had not been aware of at that stage. This would later enrage Hillier. She had not stuck to the plan. Things quickly unravelled. They both launched a cutthroat defence, blaming each other. Hillier confessed to killing Mr. Smith, but said it was only manslaughter. He denied murder. Fulstow denied all wrongdoing and maintained she was not guilty of murder or manslaughter. She was also charged with perverting the course of justice over her alleged lies in an interview with police. Held on remand in separate prisons, the couple were reunited in court as they sat next to each other in the dock. Fulstow was the first to be called to the witness box to give her side of the story. Softly spoken and emotionless, Hillier glared at her from the dock as she gave evidence for 5 days, in apparent disgust at her attempts to throw him under the bus and minimalise her own involvement. When it was Hillier's turn, it appeared as if he was enjoying his time in the spotlight. Taking the oath, he emphasised the word truth as he promised to tell the whole truth while staring at Fulstow. Knowing he was guilty, he tried to drag her down with him. She sat on, impassively making notes as he made lurid allegations against her. Pontificating from the witness box, at one point he said, "You can be a man of good morals and still break the law." He claimed to be ashamed of his actions, now being rid of the fog of drug addiction, but not ashamed enough to plead guilty to murder and save Mr. Smith's family the added trauma of having to listen to him recount in graphic detail exactly just how their loved one was murdered. Michael Hillier, 39 at the time of sentencing, was found guilty of murder. Rachel Fulstow, 37 at the time of sentencing, was found guilty of murder and perverting the course of justice. Both were jailed for life at Minshall Street Crown Court, with Hillier ordered to serve a minimum of 33 years and Fulstow 30. Detective Chief Inspector Gina Brennand of GMP's Major Incident Team said, "My thoughts and the thoughts of the investigation team will always remain with Liam's family. They will never ever get over this tragedy, nor should they be expected to, and the actions of Michael and Rachel were nothing short of despicable." On the night of Liam's murder, police and other emergency services were working incredibly hard to try and ascertain the facts. It was unclear what had happened to Liam that night, and it was incredibly concerning for residents. The investigation involved hundreds of hours of CCTV footage and phone records, which were carefully filtered through by officers. I'd like to thank members of the public for responding to our appeals with information and footage. Your assistance has helped us build a timeline of events prior to Liam's death and has been crucial for helping us get to this outcome today. No sentence will ever be enough to reflect the despicable attack on a much-loved family man, but we do hope the sentences bring some comfort to Liam's family that these two individuals will spend the majority of their lives behind bars to be constantly reminded of the consequences of their actions.